Hi, everybody. Hey, welcome back. This is going to be the chapter 7. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen here a bit. There we go. Chapter 7 deals with managing users and user groups and stuff. Okay. And so, that's a pretty simple concept here. Get a chance to go in. One of the first things when it talks about the managing users would be like taking a look at the password file, the PASSWD file. Now, this is a text file that you can open in Vim, right, and make changes to it or get it or something like that, just like you would use Notepad to open a batch file, whatever. Okay. And part of the process is you would see things like this long line here, Amber : X : 1000 : 100 : whatever. I mean, this whole long line. Well, each one of those would before the colons are broken out to explain that in this file, it has the first part, username. X just represent that there is a password. It doesn't tell you what the password is. It's not encrypted here. It's just telling you that there's a password and stuff. A user identifier, a group identifier. So if you're part of a group or not or whatever, okay. GE codes, which we don't use any of the General Electric stuff anymore, whatever. But more importantly, your home directory, that would be like your user directory for you specifically. And then the starting bash file or bash program that you're using, okay? So what is your command line? Are you using bash? Are you using bourne? Are you using corn? What are you using as your terminal emulator, okay? The second thing is to go into the shadow file. Again, same kind of structure. One of the biggest thing you might see is the encrypted password is in the shadow file. So if you were to edit this text file, which is shadow, okay, you would see from this colon here all the way over to this colon, that's the actual encryption for whatever password this person used, okay? Now, again, this is the kind of thing that you would keep users from really accessing. A hacker would love to be able to see the encrypted code, because that's what they would use to try to break your password encryption, okay, because they can see it. On the password file, the X just indicates that there was a password, okay, but this one here in the shadow file actually shows the encrypted password. It doesn't show you the text in the clear, but it does show you it's encrypted. It gives you things like when was the password last changed, okay, how many days do you have before you have to change your password again, or when does your password expire? A lot of times network people and stuff, we give users warning to remind them, hey, your password's going to expire, next Friday or whatever. We pick a date or whatever, and then what do you want? Do you want it to be disabled at that point if they don't do it? In which case, then they can't get any of the work done because they waited till the last minute, they forgot about it. Or are you going to give them a little bit more time, kind of reservations, things like that. So these are all inside those text files, just as a quick reference way. Okay, now you can go through the GUI and actually take a look at each one of those things. Let me scroll down here a bit, and inside the GUI, the graphical interface, okay, in your YAST program, you can look at each of your users and you can decide. Let me come down here. Hold on, user options. Yes, well, they're going to go through some of the change users first. Okay, so, managing groups. Okay, so we're going to have groups and stuff, and we're going to have users that go together. And again, that does a pretty good job, okay? But when you go through and you start looking at some of this stuff here, you're going to get into the, instead of focusing on the groups at this level, I'm going to scroll all the way back down here and start saying, okay, here we go. Here's the YAST area, okay? So this is like going through control panel, right? And so let's say that you have an account and stuff, and your account is Dustin Finnemore, right? That's the user, okay? And the user's the username and stuff, the password, things like that. This is the graphical side where you can go through and change things, the ID, the home directory, and things like that, And so the first half of this chapter, look, here you go. Number of days before the password expires, number of days the user's usable, whatever, and so on, expiration date. So this is the stuff that allows you to do it on the graphical interface side. So when you look at this chapter, break it into two parts, chapter 7. There's the kind of the command line side, okay, especially on the make a user group, whatever, edit the user, okay, and do it from the text editor side, or the other half of this chapter, which is to go through the graphical user interface, okay, so you get that kind of feel. If I jump down to the summary here, and kind of look here again, those two files are really important, the shadow file and the password file, because there's a lot of good information are there, especially to a hacker, okay, but administrators and stuff can use that kind of information too, because they know how to read that code, okay? And then the things like the user add command, okay, to be able to add users, to be able to modify user mod commands, to delete users or whatever and stuff, to add groups, okay, and so on. And so, the YAST program and stuff is the graphical interface. So again, Yes, yet another setup tool, also known as, in Windows, they called it what? Control panel. Okay, so again, hope that kind of gives you just a brief underscore of what's inside this chapter. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here, and I'll end my recording. You guys have a great one.